Welcome to episode 11 of Who Killed Bobby Kennedy, an ongoing investigation into the murder of Senator Robert Kennedy on the campaign trail in June of 1968, and the trial of his convicted killer, Sirhan Sirhan. In the previous 10 episodes of this series, I presented to you, the listener, the case for the prosecution and the defense, including court documents, witness testimony, including Sirhan's own, in the courtroom, in his notebooks, and interviews he's given over the past 56 years. I've also brought you interviews with experts on the case, historians, journalists, and authors who represent both the conspiratorial view and also those who believe that Sirhan acted alone. Once you've finished this podcast series, you'll have all of the evidence you need to make up your own mind as to Sirhan's guilt or innocence, because you, the people, are the jury. On this episode, it's my pleasure to welcome back British author and historian Mel Ayton, whom I interviewed on episode 8 of this series, where we explored Sirhan's motive for the crime. And Mel is the author of The Forgotten Terrorist, Sirhan Sirhan and the Assassination of Robert Kennedy, originally published by Potomac Books in 2008. The updated 2019 edition features a foreword by Professor Alan Dershowitz. Mel also has a new book coming out later this year, which is the first ever real biography of RFK's convicted killer. It's titled The Making of an Assassin, Why Sirhan Sirhan Murdered Robert Kennedy. Mel Ayton makes the most compelling argument that I've ever heard for Sirhan's guilt and presents an airtight case for the prosecution. So as this series reaches its conclusion, I wanted to give Mel Ayton the closing argument. He says that Sirhan is right where he belongs, in prison for life. We are broadcasting this episode live on X Spaces so that Mel can take your questions towards the end. We're going to have a Q&A portion of the program and speak to the listeners all over the world. Mel is located in Durham, England, and joins us now. Welcome back, my friend. It's a pleasure to have you here again. How are you?
It's good to be back, Laurie. Yes, hello.
Your forthcoming book on Sirhan is truly fascinating. You were kind enough to provide me an advance copy of the manuscript, and reading it, I felt for the very first time in 35 years of studying the RFK assassination that I truly understood Sirhan, what makes him tick, how his life experiences shaped his politics, and what drove him to murder Senator Kennedy. In our previous interview, we delved deeply into his life story, so we won't spend a whole lot of time on that here, but for those who might have missed episode 8 of this series, let's give the listeners a brief biographical sketch of Sirhan. He was born in Jerusalem on March 19th, 1944, to his father, Sirhan Bishara Sirhan, and mother, Mary Sirhan. They had 13 children, 6 of whom died young. If you would, Mel, tell me a little bit about Sirhan's childhood growing up in Palestine, his earliest memories of the 1948 war that immediately followed the creation of Israel, and how that experience shaped his life.
The most important tragic, traumatic experience that Sirhan had was when he was 4 years old. And that was 1947, when it was before the outbreak of the Arab states' attack on Palestine. And but there was trouble was brewing, from 1946 onwards. So Sirhan was 4-year-old. He lived in just outside the walled city, Masrara. He went out with his father, and he witnessed the bombing of the Damascus Gate. That was by the Irgun, and there were attacks on, made by both sides, of course, because of the conflict. And so, he had a real traumatic experience there. During the next year, 2 years, well, till 1956, really, at the time when he emigrated to the United States, he'd witnessed, quite a number of incidents in the conflict. there's no doubt that, like all children at that time, they were pretty disturbed by the violence.
He tells the story, or I've heard it repeated in other stories, that, he had seen a man disemboweled by a bomb during that conflict, that was a memory he had as a little child. And also, he lost his older brother, Munir, who was hit by a speeding truck, was it?
Yes, that was during the conflict between the Arabs and the Jews, and yes, he didn't actually see Munir being killed, but of course it had a terrible effect on the whole family. Um, it was a runaway lorry, and so really it wasn't the only thing he witnessed. He witnessed quite a number of things that were we would deem to be absolutely horrific for a child to see. Um, Quite a lot, actually. Yeah. Munir, by the way, was named after the brother who's still alive, living in Pasadena, in the same house. Actually, they lived in during the assassination of Robert Kennedy. Munir's the youngest. He was named after the child who was killed. Um, Still alive. He suffers from um, an eye ailment, uh, practically blind, really, which is one of the reasons Sirhan gives to the parole boards to say that he'd like to be released to look after his brother.
And so Munir, the youngest, he's the last, besides Sirhan, the last of the living 13 children, right?
He is, yes.
I should point out to our listeners that Sirhan is not Muslim. That's often misunderstood. He's a Christian Palestinian. He attended Christian schools as a child. Um, can you tell me a little bit about what he was taught there in the Christian schools in Jerusalem?
Well, it was the Martin Luther School inside the old city. One of his teachers, Mr. Suhail, was very fanatical in his support of the Palestinians, and with it, of course, had a big influence on Sirhan and influenced Sirhan in his hatred of Jews. Uh, this, of course, uh, has never stopped, really. It's one of the root causes of the conflict. The UN has examined this time and time again, and the, the school textbooks are laden with hatred of Jews. So, this hatred really is the root cause of the assassination of Robert Kennedy.
I want to move to 1951, when King Abdullah of Jordan was assassinated by a Palestinian gunman who did so on the orders of the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin al-Assani, leader of the Palestinian Arabs, and also was a notorious Nazi collaborator during World War II and a personal friend of Adolf Hitler. As a child of 7 years old, Sirhan became fascinated with the king's assassination and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, where the murder took place. And that was just a short walk from the house that Sirhan Sirhan lived in. And this event began his lifelong obsession with political assassinations. Can you tell me more about that?
He, I don't think he witnessed it, but he was there. He was in the area at the time, and according to his father, he just became pretty obsessed with it. Um, so that was his first inkling about how assassinations can cause great upset in the political arena. Um, so yes, he was. It had an effect on him. He was only 6 or 7 years old at the time, but later he continued with this idea that assassination as a tool of change remained with him. So it wasn't just because of Robert Kennedy that he had this idea of assassination. It was during his schooling, and he would underline passages in school textbooks, which showed that he believed in, assassination, violence as a tool for political change.
And I think I read in your book, actually, or your forthcoming book, where you really went into detail about the library books I think he had, or school books as a child, and that he had written notes in the margins and underlined things about the assassination of President Lincoln, President McKinley. Did I have that correct?
Yes, and he read a lot about JFK, of course,
Mm.
and know, read books about the assassination. So in many ways, his act was a copycat crime.
It seems that way, doesn't it? It really seems that way. Let's move forward to 1955, when Sirhan was 11 years old. His father met a man in Israel who would change his life and help to bring the Sirhan family to the United States. He's a very interesting and famous man. Who was he?
He was a Christian who traveled widely with his wife, especially the Middle East and especially Israel. And, he was out one day, and Bishara Sirhan, Sirhan's father, approached him looking for a sponsor to move to the United States. And, you know, he didn't, the sponsor didn't want to do it at first, but was persuaded because Bishara wrote to him a number of times. And he finally gave in and he said, "Yes, I will help you." And it was through the auspices of the church he was a member of. And of course, you had the UN helping, during the Eisenhower years, you had help for refugees. He came to regret it because he found that Bishara Sirhan really didn't like the culture of the United States. He didn't like any of the jobs. He was very, uh, you know, sort of finicky about each job he had. And so the sponsor came to believe that, he just wasn't a very good candidate for citizenship of the United States. And Bishara believed that too. He just didn't like the culture. Things were different. He was very controlling of his wife, very controlling of his children. And when his children tasted the freedom of the United States, he just didn't like that at all. So after a short time, he left. He went to work in New York for a time, and then returned home.
And if I understand correctly, Sirhan didn't want to leave Palestine. Is that right?
He didn't. He was 12 years old, and in fact, he left. He fled the home, and was missing for a while because he just didn't want to leave Jerusalem.
And then once they came to America, Sirhan had trouble adjusting to life in America. Like his father, he never liked it here. And eventually, his father abandoned the family and returned to what is now called the West Bank, leaving his mother Mary to raise all those kids by herself. And from the sounds of it, she certainly had her hands full with the boys, some of whom got into trouble with the law themselves. Tell me about that. And do you think that Sirhan and his brothers learned violence from their father, who was reported to be abusive to them and to his wife?
Well, that's true. There was a lot of conflict within the family, but it wasn't the United States necessarily that sparked this estrangement between Bishara and his sons. The two oldest sons didn't come to the United States till 1960, 4 years later. But when they lived in Jerusalem, the two oldest sons would borrow money in their father's name, and that really caused Bishara kicked them out of the house in Jerusalem and told him to live somewhere else. So, it started then in Jerusalem. But when they got to the United States, the father was not with the two oldest boys. Didn't go to the United States in 1960 because, as I say, shortly after 1956, about a year later, he was back in the West Bank. With the other sons, they just rebelled against the father, Bishara. They didn't like. They saw firsthand, of course, the way that the father treated the mother, which was just appalling, really. But the excuse he gave was, it's part of the culture.
And Sirhan resisted becoming a United States citizen because of our support for Israel. Radical politics and anti-Zionism ran in the family. His brother, Adele, was actually convicted in 1973 by a federal court for threatening the life of Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir.
That wasn't Adele, no. Adele came out as being one of the, the decent, with the only sort of really decent guy who didn't get into trouble. The one who threatened, look, I may get this wrong. I think it was, the two oldest were Saidella and Sharif, and it was either side. I think it was.
I think you're right. I think it was Sharif.
Most of the boys got into trouble, but getting back to Sirhan and his citizenship, no, even at school, he told his fellow students and teachers, no, he had no intention of it. He's not, he doesn't want to be an American, didn't want American citizenship. He wanted to, he clearly he always wanted to go back to what he called his homeland. When he cried out after he shot Robert Kennedy, "I did it for my country," people couldn't understand what he meant. What he was talking about was, "I did it for the Palestinian people. That's my country, the West Bank." Remember, your listeners will know this, that it wasn't until the 1967 war, Six-Day War, that the West Bank it was controlled by Jordan, and it was taken over by the Israelis during the Six-Day War, and that's what Sirhan was referring to. The rest of the family as well, they just weren't too keen on citizenship at all. They always, one of their friends, Lou Shelby, who owned the nightclub where Dell worked, playing the oud, said that it always struck him, and he was from the Lebanon. He said the family always struck him as a kind of an insular group, a family who really didn't want. They wanted the good things that America had to offer, but they still maintained their strong affiliation to the Middle East as Arabs.
And after Sirhan shot Bobby Kennedy in 1968, his mother Mary called it, quote, "a patriotic act." Can you explain what she meant by that?
Yeah, initially, Mary Sirhan was treated as like a sympathetic character, really, in the American press. It was later that she revealed her true colors, and yes, she said patriotic, meaning he was fighting for the Palestinians against the Jewish-controlled America. That's the way she saw it. She had real strong anti-Semitic views. She told in fact, Sirhan's best friend, Walter Crowe. She said to Walter, have you ever smelled a Jew? I mean, it's that deep-rooted type of anti-Semitism that
Wow.
was predominant in the family. Yeah. We get a true picture of Mary Sirhan outside of the months and years after the assassination, when people saw her as, a sympathetic character. But files that I've researched to find out, her true character has revealed how really anti-Semitic she was. But she wanted, as I say, the riches and the good job and all of that of the United States. It was, you holding two like contradictory opinions in your head at the same time, I suppose.
Hmm. That's interesting. It was fascinating to me to discover in your new book that after his arrest for the murder of Senator Kennedy, that Sirhan got support from the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem himself, Ajamin al-Hassani, who put out a call across the Arab world for Palestinian liberation organizations to raise funds for Sirhan's legal defense and for Arab lawyers in the United States to come to his aid. And, during his decades of parole hearings, I think he's been turned down for parole like 17 times now. But over the years, Sirhan has had support from Palestinians and Arab exiles living in the United States. And I wanted to ask you about a gentleman named M.T. Mehdi. Is it pronounced Mehdi?
It is, yes,
Okay,
MEHDI. Yeah.
Mehdi. And he was then the Secretary General of the Action Committee on American Arab Relations and one of the earliest pro-Palestinian activists in the United States. He believed that Sirhan had acted, quote, in justifiable self-defense. He said, quote, Sirhan was defending himself against those 50 Phantom jets that Senator Kennedy was sending to Israel. Mehdi even wrote a book on the subject, little known book called Kennedy and Sirhan Why? It was this relationship with Mehdi and Sirhan's insistence that he acted as an avenger of the Palestinians. That's what would persuade nearly every parole board over the years to conclude that Sirhan had not changed, that he was proud of what he had done, despite claiming he had no memory of it. And of course, they said that he was unsuitable for parole. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? That's fascinating to me.
Yeah, that MT Mehdi was one of the, you know, uh, Arab Americans in the United States who heeded the call of the Mufti to help Sirhan. Um, the Sirhan's lawyers as well also had the help of another. I, I wouldn't call him extreme, but another really committed Palestinian defender. So Sirhan did have help, but Sirhan's lawyers did not want to take that approach at the trial. They just wanted to claim diminished responsibility, that he was in some type of fugue when he committed the crime. Um, but yes, Sirhan did, loved the idea that his fellow Palestinians were helping him, and thereafter, for the next 50 years, took a two-track approach. On the one track, he had his defenders and conspiracy writers in the United States saying, oh, look, he was a hypnotized assassin. It wasn't his Palestinian fanaticism, it was the CIA and all of the sort of, dark forces in the United States. Um, so he accepted their help, but at the same time, just, loved the fact that, he was seen as a hero amongst his people, amongst the Palestinians. So this two-track approach at last, went on. It still goes on, I think, because of course he has to, before a parole board, he has to, um, tell the board that he's culpable in some way, whilst on the other, he's sort of hinting all the time that, he may have been hypnotized, and, all of this, mumbo jumbo that's produced by his defenders. So really, he thought he could get away with taking this two-track approach, but no, of course he hasn't been able to get away with it. He claims amnesia. I've produced a number of times when he's fallen foul of that because he's given himself away. One of the defense investigators at his trial, Michael McCowan, actually said he was sitting next to Sirhan at the trial, and when two busboys from the Ambassador Hotel were given their evidence, Sirhan was saying, no, I didn't, and then Michael McCowan said, well, remember, you can't remember that, so how can you actually sort of challenge them? And then he gulped and thought, it's another giveaway. And then on another occasion, he said, well, at least Kennedy saw me. And then, his sort of defenders were saying, well, how on earth, can you say that? Because you say that you have no memory. All of these contradictory things are, sort of exist throughout the parole hearings over the last 50 years. And, it takes a long time to dig them out because you're talking about thousands of pages. But, he was, he slipped up quite a number of times, which proves that, yes, he did remember.
And wasn't it McCowan that he was talking to, where McCowan asked him, why didn't you shoot Senator Kennedy between the eyes? And Sirhan said, because the son of a bitch turned his head at the last minute.
Correct. He said that too.
And McCowan, I believe, filed an affidavit stating as such.
He filed it for Dan Mulder. And by the way, look, my work is built on the excellent expert work of Dan Mulder, who's the man, in my opinion, solved this case. There were many anomalies. It was right that people questioned these things going back to the 1970s, of course. But since that time, an awful lot of these things have been sorted out, and yet they are still, writing lies about the case. The conspiracy writers. Can I give you, before I forget, can I give you one example of how these conspiracy theorists still try to tell people about there were all these conspiratorial shenanigans going on? They weren't. They were all sorted out. And it was right that people brought them forward in the 1970s, but it was Dan Mulder who solved an awful lot of them. And that's why his book is the definitive work on the assassination, really. So the example I'm going to give you is this. They try to claim that a guy called Everett Buckner, who's the gun range master where Sirhan was practicing on the day of the assassination on June 4th. And Everett Buckner is supposed to say he was with a girl, and then they try to link that with a polka dot dress girl at the gun range, and she supposedly said, "Get away from me! Somebody will see us." All of this conspiratorial stuff supposedly on. I mean, it's absolute nonsense. It's just made up stuff. Everett Buckner later said, "I'm sorry, I just made that up." And they also, the conspiracy writers, don't say who this girl was. And she was an innocent woman there with her husband. It was a birthday. She got a pistol for a birthday. And so, this is how they build their case. They just invent stories. And that story was wrong. Williams was her second name. Yeah. Lived in the Los Angeles area and just totally innocent, with a husband and two children. And, but they don't name her. Claudia Williams, she was called. They don't name her. Why? Because they want to keep this uh, mystery alive. They could have named her because it's right there in the records, in the files. Um, and that's a really terrible thing to do. They did this. I think they did it on purpose to make to keep the mystery going. But so that's an example of how they do it. They just omitted her name, Claudia Williams, innocent woman.
There's unfortunately a lot of innocent people who've been dragged into this conspiracy nonsense over the years who, you know, doubt and suspicion is cast upon them, and they probably just had absolutely nothing to do with it. In fact, we're going to talk a little bit about the security guard later on, Thane Eugene Caesar, who has often been pointed to as the real killer or the second gunman, and also the famous girl in the polka dot dress. There
Oh
were
yeah.
several, I think 3 different women who were there that night wearing polka dot dresses of different colors. And, I think it was like 17 witnesses supposedly saw Sirhan in the company of this pretty young woman in a polka dot dress, which
Yeah.
in my mind proves absolutely nothing that she was up to anything nefarious. To me, it just sounds like Sirhan was your basic 24-year-old man who had four
Exactly.
Tom Collins
They,
drinks, and he was trying to get a little action.
absolutely, yes, of course. And there are also, there's so many writers who talk about, the girl in the polka dot dress was the only one who left the pantry out of the 77 people in the pantry. I mean, that's nonsense. There were people going in, there were people coming out. I've got these all the files, the records, the statements there, which show this. People were rushing out, they were escaping the shooting. People were coming in because they were hearing the shooting. And to say that they were the only people who left the party, it's nonsense. You mentioned before, Laurie, that so many people have been dragged in, innocent people have been dragged in. Let me give you an example. William Pepper was Sirhan's lawyer. He had quite a few lawyers over 50 years, of course, but William Pepper was one of them. William Pepper defended James Earl Ray with his conspiracy story. Um, what William Pepper did was that it was really disgraceful. What he did was name a person he thought, an army guy who he thought was dead. Sadly for him, the guy wasn't dead, and there was a CBS news program where this guy was brought in to meet William Pepper, and he was just so embarrassed because, but it wasn't an innocent thing he was doing, naming this guy. He destroying his life. Another one was a Portuguese immigrant who was supposed to be Raoul, the real shooter, the real man behind James Earl Ray, ruined his life with these accusations that he was a killer, that he killed Martin Luther King. I mean, it's just terrible. That was all investigated and proven to be totally bogus. So throwing things around like this has had an effect on many innocent people's lives.
Well, yeah, I mean, especially Thane Eugene Caesar, the late Thane Eugene Caesar, who passed away in 2019. I honestly used to believe a lot of these stories that, maybe he did fire his weapon that night. Maybe he was the guy standing behind Kennedy who actually delivered the fatal shot. Because that story's been circulating for so many years, and a lot of people tell it pretty convincingly, and they had me convinced. But then when I
Yeah.
really looked into this, I came to realize that he was most likely what he always claimed to be, an innocent man, falsely accused, and that he spent, 40, almost 50 years of his life having to deal with being accused of a murder of Robert Kennedy that he probably just was completely innocent of. It's tragic.
Absolutely. He saw lawyers, and lawyers said to him, there's no point in suing these people because they haven't got any money. Uh, the guy who actually, researched his life thoroughly, from top to bottom, was Dan Mulder. And it was Dan who researched his bank records, his finances, and yet the conspiracy writers say, he worked for the Skunk Works, Lockheed, and all of that. They just try to tie people in, A knows B knows C knows D, therefore A knows D. And it's just incredible the amount of work that Dan Mulder did researching Thane Eugene Caesar's life. And a totally innocent man. I spoke with him, Gene Caesar, the year before he died. I mean, he thanked me, obviously for my help as well. But the big hero in his life was Dan Mulder, who, most rational people, which doesn't include the conspiracy believers, really, because I don't think they're irrational. They just can't, they can't see the wood for the trees. So yeah, we have Dan Mulder to thank for that. He's totally innocent. And when you look at the dynamics, I mean, I've researched the dynamics of the shooting, of course, and when you look at the dynamics, not one witness. There were, let's say, there were 77 people in the pantry, but the 12 people nearby around Kennedy. Gene Caesar escorted them into the pantry, and then when the shooting started, he stood back. Not one witness saw him with a gun in his hand at that time. Not one witness saw him shoot Kennedy in the back of the head while Sirhan was shooting from the front towards Gene Caesar, by the way. What assassins, that's stupid enough to do that. So he fell to the floor. He got up. That's when he got his .38 pistol out, which was checked by his supervisor. Before when he started work at the Ambassador about 6 o'clock. He was called in at the last minute as well. I mean, some incredible conspiracy here. Called in the last minute. He wasn't supposed to work that night. So not one person saw him, and yet, they create this. They've got to have a second gunman, you see, and this is what they do. Totally innocent. Yeah.
And Dan Mulder is one tough crime reporter.
I mean, if you read his book, The Hoffa Wars,
Yeah.
Laurie, I mean, he's risked his life time and time again, actually, to get stories out.
That's right.
Certainly about mafia-linked Teamsters and Jimmy Hoffa, and wow, yeah, a real American hero, investigative author.
And no shrinking violet, Dan Mulder. I mean, when he first met Gene Caesar, I think was sometime in the 80s, tracked him down. He thought that Gene Caesar was dead. And Gene Caesar wanted people to think he was dead because he was so tired of being harassed about shooting Robert Kennedy. And so Dan Mulder is a great reporter. He managed to track him down. And at the time, he believed that Gene Caesar was the guilty one. And so he came on really strong with Gene Caesar.
He did. He did. In fact, as I said before, there is nothing wrong. When the LAPD files weren't released until the 80s, there's nothing wrong with looking at, this doesn't look right, this doesn't sound right. But, all of these things have been investigated, especially by the likes of Dan Mulder. And they're found to be, people just cannot accept that you have coincidences happening in life. They don't accept that you've got rather strange connections with people. If you tied a piece of string to everybody, you'd be absolutely amazed at the connections people have and the links. So he did all this on Thane Caesar, and yet they still, sort of refuse to. They just ignore the facts. It's as simple as that. They want their story out. They want their mystery, their drama, and their intrigue. And unfortunately, it's sad to say this, that some publishers want that. Why? Because it brings the money in. I remember listening to your program about one particular conspiracy writer who said, there's no money in conspiracy. Well, let me tell you a story about my book. When I told my agent, who lives in Georgia, when I was writing the forgotten terrorist. And I told my agent that, I finished the manuscript, and she said, well, did you find a conspiracy? I said no. I mean, she was deflated because as an agent, she knew full well that conspiracy books sell. So what this conspiracy writer said to you is nonsense. This is what people buy.
Well,
Unfortunately.
Dan Moldia, his publisher was also disappointed when he wrote his
Yeah,
1995
you're right.
book on the assassination of Robert Kennedy. He
Yeah.
was originally signed to do that book with the understanding that it was going to be a conspiracy book and that he was going to
Yep.
clear Sirhan Sirhan and actually prove that Gene Caesar was the true assassin. And in the course of writing his book, and by the way, Dan Moldia is the only author who's ever interviewed both Gene Caesar and Sirhan Sirhan multiple times. He's established
Yeah.
that those two men did not know each other. So therefore, there could not have been any conspiracy between those two. They just didn't know each other from Adam. And also, in the course of researching that book, Dan came to see that Gene Caesar was innocent, even though he started out thinking he was guilty. He did several interviews with him. He managed to, uh, I guess, coax Gene Caesar into taking a polygraph test, which he passed with flying colors, administered by
With
Gelb.
with That's right, Laurie. With one of the best polygraph examiners in the United States. Uh, you're right. Yeah.
And he also did a stress test and passed that as well,
Correct.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So
So he's, when he turned around, you're right. His publishers were a bit deflated too. But look, Dan Mulder is the true, the great American investigative journalist, because no matter what you confront, you find, you tell the truth. Uh, I People, many conspiracy writers have accused me of being, a pawn in the hands of the CIA. But I research and I investigate like Dan Mulder, and I'm willing to come out with what the truth is, not what I want people to hear, or not what I want to present as a dramatic story. For the sake of like making money. And I did that with a book called Justice Denied. And I was given, I mentioned this to you on my last interview, Laurie. Secret File, Scotland Yard. It was about the assassination of the British governor of Bermuda. And, I found out that it was a conspiracy, and bigger than what they were saying it was, with two guys. And so that caused a little bit of disturbance in Bermuda at the time it was published. Still selling in Bermuda now, actually. So it doesn't, so it's not a case of like defending the lone assassin position and all that. It's about telling the truth, giving the facts, not speculation, which is what most conspiracy writers do. And I've just mentioned how they do it. They do it by just manipulating the evidence, or cherry picking facts, and just going. An example I'll give you with that one. Some conspiracy Discovery Channel. I was on that a few years ago, and what they did was hire this sound engineer to check the Brzezinski recording. That's the only recording of the sound of the
is
gunshots.
that Philip von Prague, the sound engineer?
That's
Yeah.
correct. Yeah. So he came out with 14 shots fired. Well, a lot of people just don't know. It's like they didn't know about Sirhan's background, really, with his fanaticism. They didn't know the difference between an acoustics expert and a sound engineer expert, and that's how the problem started. I hired one of the best acoustics firms in Britain, based in New York. Peter French Associates. And so you had Professor Peter French, who teaches at York University, and Philip Harrison, who examined this Brzezinski tape. They also say, it was a copy. Look, it was a digitized copy. Nothing is lost when something is digitized. So they examined this copy that I got from the California archives. And no more than 8 shots, right? In other words, 8 shots or less. Philip Harrison found 7, but the real good possibility of 1 more. Now, what did the American media do? Oh, they just, including the Washington Post, actually, Tom Jackman. Oh, they just concentrated on Philip von Prague's analysis, which is proven time and time. I've had other experts as well check this, proven to be bogus. But the American media, what do? They just talk about that and say, well, there are other people who don't agree, which is really burying the real expertise, which is Peter French Associates.
Do you think that when the media doesn't talk to the other experts, those who disagree with von Prague, do you think that that's just lazy journalism, or do you think that they're being dishonest?
It is. I don't know. They might be tilting towards a political route. They might be tilting towards it's hard to figure out their motives. But one thing's for sure with the Washington Post. Tom Jackman rang me, and I was talking to Tom Jackman for an hour. And when I came to read the article in the Washington Post, I thought, good grief, he's missed out of most of the things I was telling him, which can be corroborated, which are definitive of the particular area that we were talking about. So it was just left out. So I just call it bad journalism. As Dan Mulder said, it's about time the New York Times got onto this story, because it's been ruined by all of the conspiracy writers who were getting a word in edgeways all over the place.
Right. And of course, now we live in the 21st century. Conspiracy is so hot. It's so sexy. It's what sells. It's what goes viral on the internet. And we're kind of at that point where it's really hard to convince people to do their own homework, because if they do, like I've done in producing this series, if you really go back, you look at the evidence yourself and you apply basic logic, you can see that the conspiracy angle in this case just doesn't add up. It doesn't make sense. And one last thing I wanted to say before we move on from Dan Mulder and Gene Caesar. In our last interview, Mel, you said that you had tried to persuade Dan Mulder to write a new book just about Gene Caesar, which I thought was a great idea, and just call it An Innocent Man. And I loved that.
Exactly. Yeah. Clearly, I'm no position to tell Dan what to do. Of course not. But I mean, that was my advice to him. I mean, he should, because it's just a shocking story. It's a terrible story.
It is. I think it'd be a great book. And who could write that book other than Dan Mulder? He's the one to write it.
Yeah. Someone should write about the people that William Pepper named. It was just absolutely disgraceful. Ruined two people's lives, or nearly did.
That's right. They certainly ruined Gene Caesar's life.
We shouldn't be surprised, really, in a sense, because look how many people were taken in by Alex Jones, one of the most disgraceful American so-called reporters, journalists, that the country has ever known. His bogus Sandy Hook, those kids weren't killed, the damage he did to those families. So, I was pleased to see he was in court. And the other conspiracies that the 9/11 one, oh God, that went on for such a long time. And so you have people who, they just want to believe in a conspiracy. They really do. And what damage does it do in the meantime? It damages your history. It really does. Because you've got kids growing up now thinking, oh, this happened and this happened, when actually it didn't.
Well, maybe there's hope that minds can be changed with actual facts and evidence.